As per instructions earlier, we do have time constraints, and I'd like to get everyone sitting down as quickly as possible at their seats and ready for the next talk. I'm Harry Clark. I'm the Chief Scientist of the NZACC, and really I feel absolutely honoured today, and I'm only standing up here because, fortunately, Julie Collins has COVID, but I think it's very appropriate that I introduce the next speaker. I had the great pleasure of working with Dr. Carr, the chair of the Climate Change Commission. I was a commissioner for 2 years, and I started in my role at the same time as Rod did. And Rod spoke in his first year as the chair of the Climate Commission at an NZACC Conference. And I think it's highly appropriate that in his last week as the chair of the Climate Change Commission, he finishes on December the 8th, that he's addressing the NZACC and the MPI Agri-Zero Conference again. And, you know, Rod's CV is like an entry out of who's who. Someone who's, held senior positions in banking, academia, government. He's been involved in investment in agriculture, investment in forestry, investment in solar energy, as well as being an advisor to 6 different governments on topics ranging from education, science, disaster management, right through to climate change. And so I don't know how Rod fits the time in to do all his things, but I really appreciate Rod coming here today, and I know that Rod never gives a talk that is not entertaining and informative. So, Rod, the chair is yours.
Ina mana ina iwi tēnā koutou katoa, ko Rod Carr aho. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. I'm going to give you a speech in 3 parts. The first part is bragging rights about the staff of the Commission, the enormous body of work that they have done, the data they have gathered, the models they have built, the engagement and consultation that they have undertaken, the body of evidence that has been made available to New Zealanders, to our decision makers, our business leaders, to communities, households and individuals. I believe that body of work is world-class. I believe it will stand us in good stead, and it is already being used by businesses to actually think about what the changing climate means for them, their challenges and their opportunities. Right, bragging rights over. The next 2 parts of this little talk address the reality of the changing climate, its impacts on everything except land use. And the third part is land use, which may be of interest to this audience. So let's think about the changing climate. We focused initially, because the Parliament wanted us to, on the way in which we could mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions in our effort to make our contribution ambitious but achievable towards helping hold global planetary temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. Now, it is pretty clear that if we don't stop the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air, we are toast, literally. Rather baked, rather burnt, rather dry. The combustion of fossil fuels in the open air is estimated to account for nearly 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions today, and known technologies exist to replace nearly 80% of that 80% right here, right now, without a silver bullet, without anything yet to be invented. We know what to do, we know what needs to be done, we know how to do it, we just simply seem to kowtow to incumbency, vested interests and short-term profit and myopia in our endeavour to continue to look for, find, extract and burn fossil fuels in the open air. The world has 50 years of known reserves on publicly listed company balance sheets of both fossil gas and liquid fossil fuels. We don't need to find any more. We can't burn what we have. And we have 150 years of coal, known reserves. The reality of it is we need to phase out, not just phase down, the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air. If indeed we could discover and deploy effective carbon capture and permanent storage at the point of combustion, We could extract the energy from fossil fuels without the emission of greenhouse gases. That would be good, but there is no evidence of a technologically feasible, affordable way of capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere once released from millions of points of combustion. So the residual use of fossil fuels would be at power plants generating electricity, where there is some limited prospect that at some point you might do carbon capture and permanent storage. Continuing to connect households to a gas network in the prayer and hope that we will find a way of distributing biogas at scale or hydrogen is a delusion. It is a veil to hide the truth that fossil gas should not be combusted in residential settings. And some cities and states are already banning that. There are more households connected to New Zealand's gas pipe network today than there were in 2019. That is an own goal. That's on us. You can't blame Beijing or Washington. We made a choice. It has consequences that are now revealed as major gas suppliers saying maybe they won't be able to supply gas to certain residential pipe networks. And maybe the price of gas will be dramatically high. Oh, surprise, surprise. My. We didn't see it coming because we were looking the other way. Anyway, when it comes to liquid fossil fuels, I will get to land use. The reality is that New Zealand spends $4 billion a year buying in liquid fossil fuels, largely for ground transport. That's the entire value of our sheep meat exports. By the way, that stuff then retails for nearly $8 billion in the New Zealand economy. The liquid fossil fuels are combusted at over 4 million points of combustion in our dirty old internal combustion engine motor vehicle fleet. That's a choice we make. Again, don't blame Washington. Don't blame Beijing. The importation of high-emitting motor vehicles is our choice. And known technologies can dramatically reduce tailpipe emissions from new to New Zealand vehicles. Now, today, without finding, discovering, or speculating on a new technology. The reality is we breathe the particulates from the combustion of fossil fuels at ground level, particularly in urban environments. That the Climate Change Commission's work and that from the Ministry of Health estimates that by 2035, if we are on the decarbonisation pathway for ground transport, healthcare costs in New Zealand for lung disease will be $2.1 billion a year less than the current reference pathway. It's in our own self-interest to dramatically and rapidly reduce tailpipe emissions from both new to New Zealand and the in-country fleet. So decarbonisation of energy production and use is a critical platform for decarbonisation through electrification. The New Zealand Infrastructure Commission has already estimated that we have the potential to generate from renewable energy sources 3 times the amount of renewable electricity we are likely to need this century from wind, from solar, from geothermal, from run-of-the-river hydro, and from some biomass. Don't wait for the world. Those technologies are ours. The business cases already stack up. So, what is the role of markets and what is the role of regulation? In a mixed economy, we don't do corner solutions. Nobody is arguing for only markets and prices. It would be a socially unacceptable price and a massive disruption to existing businesses and communities to allow the price to do all the work. Secondly, we don't do all regulation. In a mixed economy, there is not a social license for excessive and intrusive regulation, and we know not all regulation has the intended consequences. But we need to be smart regulators and aware of the limits of market pricing, which is bringing us to the emissions trading scheme, which of course does not set a price for half our emissions, or under the split gas target, does not set a price largely for biogenic methane emissions, which is largely the agricultural sector. So what does it set a price for? Well, the way the emissions trading scheme has come to be, it is not a capped scheme for any emissions budget period, for any year within a 5-year period or any 5-year period. Why? Because the number of units that are already, quote, in the bank, already issued and held, is estimated to be in the order of 180 million tonnes of emission rights. Of that, some are held forever, some are held as a hedge against forest liabilities, and some are available for sale. It's hard to estimate available for sale, but it could be between 60 and 80 million tonnes. In other words, one entire year of gross emissions in New Zealand, which when you focus on the delta, the change that we're looking to make, means in any year, largely emitters can meet their obligations by purchasing already issued units in the secondary market. And in fact, we're coming up to an ETS auction later this week, which will reveal again the extent to which those with obligations under the ETS feel they need to buy at auction, as distinct from drawdown in the secondary market. But it is also the case that the way we treat trees in the ETS is problematic, and the Commission has called that out repeatedly. It's not trees that are bad. Trees are one of the most cost-effective ways of withdrawing carbon dioxide from the air. The problem is they're not permanent. They blow down, burn down, get diseased, and like all living things, get old and die. So when you emit fossil carbon, you are committing to permanently have an additional area of land under forest cover for generations to come. Increased forestry can buy time, but it is not a permanent solution to getting gross emissions down. The Climate Change Commission's draft advice on the emissions budget for the period 2036 to 2040 outlines a range of choices the government has as to how to achieve budgets consistent with targets. And it is for the government to make choices, but those choices must add up. The role of the Commission is to give advice, the role of government is to make decisions, and then the role of the Commission is to be transparent in providing available to the public monitoring of progress, not against our advice, but progress against government's plans and budgets. In our reference case, the Commission sees that all things left alone, we will plant a lot of pine trees. In fact, up to 2 million hectares of New Zealand pastoral land could be planted out for carbon capture at a cost of less than $50 a tonne, leaving profits on the table compared to a current NZU price today. The problem is that by the mid-2030s, there'll be so many forestry units available, and emitters' obligations and free allocations for those emitters will mean that the price that is realised per unit in the ETS will no longer reward gross emissions reductions, will no longer keep New Zealand on target to net zero for long-life gases, and price will not play any part. A corner solution that will require black letter regulation or failure to achieve desired outcomes. So the Commission's demonstration path in EB4 sees an extra area planted in exotic forests, raising from 2.1 million hectares to 2.6 million hectares, in other words, 500,000 hectares more by 2040, of a total 26 million hectares of New Zealand land. In other words, 500,000, 2.5% of the land area. Of course, compared to the pastoral landholding of 10 million hectares, it's about 5% more of New Zealand pastoral land into exotic forests. But it's a choice. Less trees means lower gross emissions, or more risky speculation about technologies that might turn up just in time. But it is likely also to mean higher emissions prices to reward the take-up of that technology. So, you can rail against trees, but you better answer the question, if not trees, then what? Higher emission prices in the rest of the economy to cause more rapid adjustment from other means? Or simply step away from the targets and budgets as not being in our own interests any longer? But here's the rub. New Zealand is a small trading nation. We profit from access for our products to affluent foreign markets. Affluent foreign markets are already climate aware. Europe is already incurring very real fiscal and social costs to reduce emissions from all sources of all greenhouse gases. It seems unlikely they will welcome into their markets products created with high emissions that are avoidable with known technologies. And it's not just about access to those markets for our agricultural products. It's access to our markets for all the products coming from an economy and society that has choices it refuses to exercise. And that is the challenge for New Zealand, is we can't be selective about which markets we're allowed into, but we do have choices about how we're going to reduce our contribution to global warming. Which, of course, brings us to the methane question. Every sector faces challenges in reducing its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Every country has a unique set of circumstances that can justify or explain why it is different. It might be because it's poorer. It might be because it is later to develop. It might be because it doesn't have rivers that can give it hydropower, or geothermal fields that can give it relatively low emissions electricity. Or it doesn't have large fleets of dirty cars to decarbonise. Every sector and every economy can uniquely justify why it should do less, or it should do it later. We are not unique. In addition, when it comes to understanding our on-farm emissions, the emerging data is quite fascinating. First of all, because Fonterra have absolutely supported farmers in getting a number for their farm level greenhouse gas emissions. We are beginning to understand the difference between average emissions between herds within New Zealand, and that is fascinating. It looks like the most efficient dairy cows have about 8 kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions, DWP 100, per kilo of milk protein produced. And the least efficient have 18 kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of milk solids produced. This between herds within country difference utterly dominates the difference in averages between countries, making a complete lie of the myth that if we don't produce milk protein here, because on average we are better than other markets, if they're produced in other markets, leakage will occur and global emissions will be higher. The Climate Change Commission is on record as saying leakage was, quote, highly uncertain. Now we're getting the evidence that says it's highly unlikely, because you have to make the heroic assumption that it's the average cow that is being displaced by an average cow, not that it is our highest emitting herds that are relieved of their burden of contribution and replaced either in New Zealand or elsewhere by low emitting herds. And what are we understanding about the drivers of this higher emissions? One of the principal things is the type of land the cow is foraging on in order to get the dry matter to create the milk protein. Some places are just not great to be a dairy cow. Next up, different breeds of cows appear to turn dry matter into milk protein with different efficiency. And within a breed, breeding can make a difference too. But also farm management practices can make a difference. The amount of supplementary feed brought in, the precision with which animals are pushed and use the feed available. What is intriguing is the emerging data that high emitting herds also tend to be on farms that are highly leveraged. By that I mean have relatively high operating costs compared to revenue, which means they are more vulnerable to cost inflation or setbacks in dairy pricing. Which is why when some argued that banks should not take an interest in greenhouse gas emissions in thinking about credit exposure, they are simply wrong. Because high operating leverage is associated with increased vulnerability to dairy prices and on-farm cost escalation. Enough about dairy. Land use change and our sheep flocks. Contrary to what may be represented, the Climate Change Commission has not recommended a cull order on sheep. Indeed, what the Commission is simply modelling is that with land use change, in part driven by the changing climate, in part driven by the economics of sheep farming, and in part driven by alternative land use choices farmers as landowners are making, the New Zealand sheep flock is likely to continue to decline as it has for the last 40 years. The New Zealand sheep flock peaked in 1984 at 72 million sheep. By the time John Key was elected, it got down to 36 million sheep. When he left office, it was 28 million sheep. When Jacinda left office, it was 25 million sheep, and it's now just over 23 million sheep. Through economic cycles, through changes of political regime, the sheep flock has been in decline. Sheep farmers remind us that farming is a culture, not just a business. That farmers do know farming better than anyone else. And farmers have changed their land use ever since time began, and in this country, particularly under market pressures. Emerging alternative technologies, changing consumer preferences, access to foreign markets is going to do more to shape New Zealand land use than black letter regulation, prayers and hopes. I'm an optimist for New Zealand. I think we are up for the challenge. With known technologies, we can make a lot of progress now. With the benefits of further research, we can discover new ways of doing business on the land. And the future of New Zealand as an energy-independent nation, where we generate through our own efforts and natural abundance electricity to decarbonise industry and businesses, gives us a massive opportunity in our own self-interest. Kia ora.
Thank you, Rod. You didn't disappoint. And I have a host of questions, but unfortunately we only have time for a couple. One is prefaced by a big thank you for your tenure as the Climate Change Chair. But this is a lovely question. What's your single biggest piece of advice you'd give to your successor?
Don't do it my way. I think I've had the privilege of serving for 5 years as chair of the Commission. A lot of the things that have been said are important. They're not going to change. They're evidence-based. They will help inform business and business choices as well as choices facing our elected leaders. But people get a bit bored with hearing the same things said the same way by the same person. It's time for a change, and that change will possibly say the same things in different ways or say different things that need to be said.
Thank you. And the final one, Rod, and this particularly relates to the agricultural sector. What are your thoughts on the role of government regarding incentives/rebates for farmers when mitigation technologies become available, building on your multiple approaches to the mitigation?
So here's one of the problems. If farmers don't face a price for their emissions, they have no business case to incur any cost. So they'll be reliant on regulation, and the regulation may come from their customers. Don't underestimate the power of the buyers of the meat and milk protein through what really amounts either to regulation, simply I won't take your product unless, is a way the private sector does quote regulation, or the dirty discount. I don't think you're going to get green premiums. I think the sustainable farming practices are going to be expected and required. There will always be somebody to buy meat and milk protein at a discount. Our problem is we are not a low-cost producer and we can't sell stuff to the markets that might want it, but cheaper. So in the absence of a price, there's no business case to take up a cost in order to reduce emissions. You'll either be told what to do. I don't think government should be running around providing subsidies, either in the search for fossil gas or in the take-up of emissions reduction technology, unless you do it with a very clear mandate that says, for the first 1,000 farmers, we'll fund it to show it works and as demonstration. But we are not going to lock this in as a forever right to pollute. We are going to expect your business to figure out how to meet the costs of sustainable farming.
Thank you, Rod. I think it's a wonderful note to finish on. And I think from a number of us, many thanks for your role as chair of the Climate Change Commission. It was a challenging task, but you've achieved with great aplomb and great dignity. And also a very special thank you from the NZACC. You've spoken at our conferences on a regular occasion, and we've never been disappointed. So many thanks, Rod.